Okay, so it never rains but it pours. After all these weeks of only having 3 questions, I got 7 questions this week, and indeed 7 questions in a single email from a single student. Um, so I'm going to deal with those now. They're all really, really good questions and important ones, and I think they'll be very useful to think about these questions. Let's have a look at the first one. Okay, so the first one asks, Shapiro says that Bentham thinks people are selfish and will act for their own happiness, not for society's. So if people do act for the good of society, donating to charity, volunteering, voting for policies to help those in poverty, etc., Bentham will just say that doing these things makes the person happy, therefore they are still acting from their own happiness. Yes, that's exactly what Bentham would say. This theory is known as psychological egoism. Okay, psychological egoism, the idea that people only ever do things for themselves, for their own happiness, for their own pleasure, for their own utility. Now, one thing I want you to note about this thesis, this psychological egoism, is that it's not a philosophical theory. Right? It's not a theory about justice. It's not a theory about what's morally right and wrong. It's a theory about human psychology. And because of that, it's a scientific theory. Right? It's a theory about something that we have a science. Right? We have a science of psychology, so it's a claim about psychology, a claim about a scientific claim. And because of this, there's a problem with Bentham's view. And most people now would regard Bentham as simply wrong about this. And that is that Bentham sets up his view in a way that nothing could count as evidence against it. All right, so, and you bring this out wonderfully in this question. So you say, what about people who volunteer, who give away to charity, who voting for policies that to help alleviate poverty and so on? What do you say about all these cases? And you can ramp it up. You can talk about cases where people put their lives at risk for others and so on. What do you say about all those cases? Well, all those cases, Bentham is just going to say, oh, yeah, but still in those cases, people are only doing it for their own happiness. And the problem with such a theory is it becomes unfalsifiable. That is, no evidence could actually count against no even possible evidence, not just the evidence that actually exists, no possible evidence could count against it. And people will say, the language that people will use is that the theory becomes unfalsifiable. No evidence could count as evidence against the theory because Bentham will just turn around and say, oh, yes, that person, devoted her whole life to the service of others. Yeah, but she only did it for her own sake. She only did it because it made her happy or whatever, right? No possible, this person died for the sake of somebody to try and save somebody else's life. Yeah, that person only did it for the sake of their own happiness. No evidence could possibly count as evidence against the theory, and for that reason, it's not genuinely a scientific theory at all. It's, to use the jargon, it's just a tautology. Don't worry about the jargon too much. But the point here is that this is a scientific claim that Bentham is making. Psychological egoism is a scientific claim, but it doesn't actually live up to its own requirements. A scientific claim has to be falsifiable, not falsified, falsifiable. It has to be the kind of thing that could turn out to be false. So think, for example, about, that light, that colour is caused by the reflection of certain, colour on a surface is caused by the reflection of certain frequencies of light from that surface. That's a scientific theory, and it's falsifiable, but it's falsifiable in the sense that we could come up with evidence to prove it false. It's possible to, right? And so it's a genuine scientific theory. But Bentham's isn't a genuine scientific theory because he just won't allow anything to count as evidence against it. It's just a tautology. And so most people now, I think everybody now would say that Bentham's thesis is false. Now, that's not to say that human beings aren't egoistic. That's a psychological claim, and psychologists will have different opinions about that. But the key point to make here in this context is this is a scientific claim And whether people are actually like as the way Bentham claims or not, that's a matter for psychologists to determine, not for philosophers. But Bentham wrote this before psychology was really an established discipline. I mean, it was really only in its very embryonic form when Bentham wrote, but that's no longer the case. Okay, that's a great question. Next question. Although few people would sign up to Nozick's pleasure machine, don't you think that many people in society are already doing such a thing, at least part-time, by watching TV, playing video games, etc., obtaining pleasure in a completely fictional world as a distraction from their life? Well, again, I think this is a great question. I think it's a very interesting thing to think about. And I mean, I guess that there's no doubt that there is a lot of this going on. I think, that, remember what's the objection, the general objection to, or one of the general objections to Bentham's thesis was the doctrine of swine. And one thing one could say about that is a lot of people seem to want to live like swine in the sense of the objection. But the objection goes, that's not really an enviable life. Now, let's think more about the question. What is it? So one might want to argue this point, but let's just concede that it looks as if a lot of people are actually living life in a way that seems to indicate that, it's not too far away from the pleasure machine. What are we to make of that? One thing that we might make of it, one thing that we might be tempted to make of it is to say, well, actions speak louder than words. People, when you give them the pleasure machine objection, they'll say, no, I won't sign up to it. But then you could turn around, if you were Bentham, you might turn around and say, yeah, but hang on a minute. If you look at how you live your life, you actually are living as if you're prepared to sign up to the pleasure machine. And so this doesn't really constitute an objection to my theory after all. So that's one way to take it. To take it as saying, you might say that you won't sign up to the pleasure machine, but if I look and see how you're actually living your life, it looks as if you would sign up to the pleasure machine because that's the kind of life that you're living. Okay, now I just would say for my part, I think that reply, that's a very interesting reply and worth consideration, but I think it's a little bit too quick. And there are a number of reasons for this. And one reason is simply that what I'm trying to figure out here, as in what you're trying to figure out, is what I think about. I'm trying to figure out what I think about Bentham's theory, and you're trying to think about what you think of Bentham's theory. We're not trying to work out what other people might think about it necessarily, right? We're trying to work out, do I really think that what Bentham is describing is the valuable life? And I don't. Because the life as described in the question is not the life that I lead. I mean, sure, there are some times that I play video games to relax. In fact, my kids just bought a PlayStation, so I've been playing it a bit myself, just to relax in the evenings and so on. But I mean, I wouldn't for a minute describe my life as dedicated to that kind of thing. And I suppose one has to wonder how much, how many people really live like that. When I think about myself, what percentage of my day would be spent doing that kind of thing? If it's nothing, I'm probably not going to lead a very happy life. There has to be some downtime, right? But anyway, that's worth thinking about. So that isn't the life that I value. So that tells me that I don't believe that Bentham is right. Okay, what's more, I think the people who choose to live like that are making a mistake. So that is, choose to live in the way that the question is framed. If people just do dedicate their lives to that, I think they're just making a mistake. And then the question would be, why is it that people make mistakes of this kind? And I think there are various kind of answers that I would give, including, for example, it's easy. But we have this idea that we kind of get in a way from the kind of thought that Bentham was promoting, that the good life ought to be kind of easy. It ought to just be fun. Right? But I don't think that's true at all. I think the good life is actually quite difficult to achieve. The philosopher I'm really thinking of when I talk about this is one that we're not studying. It's Aristotle. The good life is actually an achievement. It's not easy, and it's very easy just to, not try and live a mediocre life. And I think that's what the people, as described in the question, are doing. They're living a mediocre life. Moreover, they might accept that themselves, actually. Right? So there's this somewhat paradoxical nature about the position that I'm advancing here, and that is that people might actually prefer, in some sense of the term prefer, to lead a less worthwhile life because it's easier. But I just think that that's just a feature of human psychology, that we're not very good at committing ourselves to what's actually good for us. I think that's just what human beings are like. Okay, so I think that's a really good question. It's definitely worth giving more thought to. All right, I hope my response has been, thought-provoking to some extent at any rate. Anyway, let's go on to the next question. All right, so this is a question about Mill, and it asks, does the forced organ transplant objection apply to Mill's harm principle as well as Bentham? I won't read out the rest of this question, but you can pause it and read it if you like. I'm just going to respond. Okay, the answer is no, it doesn't apply. So, and indeed, the harm principle is designed so that it doesn't apply. So the reason that it wouldn't be acceptable for Mill to take this innocent person's vital organs and share them around is because it would harm that person, and that harm would not be needed to prevent harm to others. So no, it wouldn't be justified. So in a way, the harm principle is designed to get around this kind of objections that broadly come under the heading of the justice objection to utilitarianism, right? It's to say, no, we don't have these, we don't have to do these horrible things, these horribly unjust things that you thought we were going to have to do, because we have this harm principle, and the harm principle means that you're not entitled to inflict harm on people in circumstances such as the forced organ transplant case. That will mean, of course, that the 5 people, if it was 5, in our example, will die. But that's the consequence of applying the principle of caring about justice. One thing that is important to say here is we can't argue that not providing the vital organs to the people who need them will harm them. We can't argue that way. To not provide them with the vital organs is to fail to provide them with the benefit that they desire. But that's not the same thing as to harm them. Failing to provide someone with a benefit is not to harm them. And let me just give you an example of this. So let's just say that you're hungry and you would, there I am, I've just baked a cake, right? And you'd like some. And if I cut it up and give you a piece of cake, that's a benefit. I've given you a benefit. But we wouldn't say that if I keep the cake to myself, I've harmed you, right? It's not a harm to fail to give you the cake, but it's not to give you a benefit. But the failure to render a benefit to someone is not the same thing as a harm. And what we see in the forced organ transplant case is that if we refuse to make the forced organ transplant, right, then we fail to benefit these 5 people who desire organ transplants, but we're not harming them. And that's vitally important for Mill's theory, because if it turns out that anyone who fails to receive a benefit can argue that they've been harmed, then the harm principle doesn't mean anything. Okay, and this ties into the questions, most of the questions that follow. So the next question, would an example of the harm principle be if X assaults Y, we may interfere with X, but sending X to prison will harm X and the community, as they will not be rehabilitated. Therefore, we should sentence X to home detention instead of prison. Again, this is a great question, but it's not quite right. It's not. I thought for years that this was Mill's position, but it's not. Mill's position is this: you're not entitled to interfere with people unless it's to prevent harm to others. Now, if, so let's talk about X and Y, right? As in this question. Are we allowed to interfere with X? We're not allowed to interfere with X unless X is going to harm somebody else. Okay? Now, if X is going to harm somebody else, then, to put it as bluntly as I can, we forget about harm and focus on the principle of utility. So if X is going to harm somebody else, then we do the thing that will maximize utility. And if that involves interfering with X, then that's fine. Okay, so the harm principle is a kind of gatekeeper principle. It says don't interfere with anybody else, don't interfere with others unless they're going to cause harm to others. If they are going to cause harm to others, the harm principle goes away and we forget about harm, right? And then we can just apply the principle of utility and work out what to do. Now, having said that, it's readily arguable that sending people to prison is not what the principle of utility would require, at least in many circumstances, and for precisely the reason that you articulate here, that is that it won't rehabilitate people. If we were interested in maximising utility, the argument would be that we should be interested in rehabilitation, and so maybe home detention would work better than imprisonment. Now, that of course is an empirical claim. Is it actually true that home detention rehabilitates better than prison? That's an open question. We have to do some studies and find out. But assuming that it does, then that would be a reason why Mill would favour home detention over imprisonment. But it's not because it minimises harm, but it's because it would, in these circumstances, maximise utility. All right, great question. Next question. You say one problem with Mill's harm principle is that harm is not clearly defined. Could harm not just be defined as criminal acts? Though criminal acts are not quite aligned with harm, as indecency is in many circumstances a criminal act, but is not really clear why it is harmful. Some people argue that it is traumatising for some people to see people naked. And of course, the penalty of a criminal act is problematic, maximum life imprisonment for supply of Class A drugs compared with 20 years for rape, but no system is ever accepted as the perfect in the views of everybody. All right, the answer is no. It won't do to use the criminal law to define what harm is, because harm is the harm principle is supposed to tell us what it is that we should be criminalising. Right, so for Mill, to use the criminal law as our standard for what harm is to get things precisely around the wrong way. Right? And this was very important for Mill, and you really get at it in this question. This is really important for Mill because one of the things that he wants to do is to argue for very significant reform of the criminal law. He thought that far too many things were criminalised in the United Kingdom of his day. And I think we would all agree with that too, actually. There was a great deal of what we would regard as pretty ordinary behaviour was criminalised. And not only that, again, as you point out in your question, it was very harsh, or as you allude to in your question, it was very harsh. So it wasn't that long ago, for example, that if you, stole the equivalent of £10 by pickpocketing or something, you could be hung. Right? It wasn't so Mill is arguing, part of the point of the harm principle is to argue for a reform of the criminal law. So Mill would absolutely not want harm being defined as criminal acts. Okay, so Mill's idea is a criminal law that works properly is a criminal law that prevents harm. Okay, so if the criminal law is justified, it's justified because it prevents harm. Well, that position will end up being completely circular if what counts as harm is defined by the criminal law. So no, this won't work. This won't work at all for Mill. Very helpful question. Next question. Won't children be harmed if they are not educated, as they will be unable to get a job and survive when they are older? And also, as Mill says, educating people leads to advancement of science, knowledge, etc. And therefore, and here's the key word, benefits society as the people have more of a will and power against the government. I think in a way you've answered their own question by using that word there. The failure to give someone a benefit is not the harm. And it's very easy to argue that the failure to educate children is the failure to give them a benefit. And indeed, I mean, I would say it's the failure to give them a benefit to which they're morally entitled. But that's quite different from saying that it harms them. But it's like the cake, but okay, educator's more important than a cake, right? But it's like the failure to give a slice of cake to somebody who's hungry. That's a failure to benefit them, but that's not harming them. Even if they starve to death, it's not me that's harming them. You know, there you are starving to death, and I don't give you a slice of cake, right, and you die. Well, that might be a really callous thing that I've done. It might be totally immoral. It might be really unjust what I've done, but I haven't harmed you. Right? I've just failed to give you a benefit. Now, we might argue that it's the failure to give you a benefit that justice demands that I give you. Okay, but it's still not a harm. I'm still not harming you, right? And now, if you think that it can be unjust to fail to give someone benefits, then you don't believe in the harm principle. Okay, again, this is a superb question, right? We need to distinguish between the failure to give benefits and harming someone. If we don't make this distinction, the harm principle won't mean anything. Okay, next question. In relation to the second problem with the harm principle, that it maintains inequality, couldn't it be argued that the employer is harming the employee by not paying them a living wage? Therefore, the government needs to interfere with employers by changing the law to living wage for all, or even providing a UBI or increasing tax, and so on. And again, the answer is no, because all these things look like benefits, not harms. So this is a case in which, if you think about the cake, I am giving you some cake, but I'm not giving you as much cake as you want, or as much cake as you need. That's not a harm. I'm not, there, please give me some cake, and I give you a small piece of cake. You wouldn't say, stop harming me. Right? You might say, oh, that's nasty to give me such a small piece, right? And you may say it's unjust to give me such a small piece of the pie, the cake, right? In this case, but if you think that, that's because you don't think that what's important here is harm. See, if what's required, if what you think is I have to give you a bigger slice of the cake, but justice requires that I give you a bigger slice of the cake, right? Then it's not because if I don't give you a bigger slice of the cake, I'm harming you, because I'm not harming you if I give you no cake at all. Right? And the theories that we're going to look at now, the next two theories, Marx and Rawls, Marxism and Rawlsism, or Rawlsianism, or whatever you'd call it, these are theories that take that view very seriously indeed. And they say, this is particularly clear with Rawls, that we need to focus on this notion of distributive justice. And it's very important to work out what size of the cake everyone should have, how we should divide the cake. But that leads Rawls entirely away from the notion that harm is the key to understanding justice. Right? This takes us away from the harm principle entirely. These were sensational questions. I hope my answers to them have been helpful in helping everybody develop their understanding of the course, because these issues are so important. So thanks very much for sending these great questions.